Hello everyone, and welcome to the second of our video tutorials on non-fatal offences against the person. Today we're going to be looking at ABH under section 47 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. As a reminder, before we start, in this topic of non-fatal offences, there are 5 offences that you need to know about, and they go on a gradient from the least serious to the most serious. So assault and battery we looked at in our first video tutorial, and both of those have a maximum 6-month sentence. Today we're going to be looking at assault occasioning ABH under section 47, which jumps up from 6 months for these to 5 years. In the next video, we'll be looking at section 20 and section 18 GBHs, and they are 5 years and life as maximum sentences. Let's start by having a look at the definition of assault occasioning ABH under section 47 of OAPA. So if you were to turn to section 47 of the 1861 Act, this is the exact definition that you would see. You can see that the language, whosoever, is quite antiquated because the Act was written in 1861. So it says, whosoever shall be convicted of any assault occasioning actual bodily harm shall be liable to imprisonment for 5 years. This language is a bit confusing because when it's saying assault occasioning actual bodily harm, it's using the word assault here as common assault. So if you remember from our first video, we said that common assault means assault or battery. So this definition is actually saying if someone has done an assault or battery which has caused actual bodily harm, they can be imprisoned for 5 years. As always, when we're looking at any crime, we start by breaking down what is the actus reus, and then once we've dealt with that, we look at the mens rea. So as I've just said, when we look at that definition, it says that the defendant must have committed an assault or battery, which we know from our previous video, which caused actual bodily harm. So when we look at this actus reus of ABH, there are actually 3 elements to it. Firstly, we need to show that there was an assault or battery. Secondly, we need to show that that occasioned, that just means caused, actual bodily harm. So to give you an example of how this works, let's say I punch Chris in the face. Okay, if I punch him in the face, that's a battery because that's the application of unlawful force. If there was no injury on Chris, that would just be a battery. However, if I punch Chris in the face and I leave a bruise or I leave a black eye, if I go back to this one here, if I leave a black eye, that's an injury. Remember, for battery, there's no injury. So ABH is a step up because you've got an assault or battery which has left a fairly minor injury. Now, don't ever say this in the exam because it's really bad, but you could remember ABH as a bit hurt. We know it means actual bodily harm, but it's a bit hurt. It's small injuries, it's bruises, it's grazes, fairly minor injuries. So you can see then how an assault or battery can cause actual bodily harm. Equally, with an assault, to give you an example of how an assault could lead to ABH, an assault we know is just making the victim scared that force is going to be used against them. But if I sent Chris a threatening note and he became clinically depressed, a doctor diagnosed him with depression, I've done an assault which has occasioned actual bodily harm, and we'll see that depression can be ABH. So you've got to show there was an assault or a battery which has caused actual bodily harm. We've already studied assault and battery, and we know that occasion just means caused. So what we need to look at now with the actus reus of ABH is what does actual bodily harm actually mean? I've already alluded to it, it's a fairly small injury, but obviously we need to look at some definitions from cases on that. Our definition of actual bodily harm comes from the case of Miller, and the judge in this case said that actual bodily harm is any harm or injury that, quote, interferes with the health or comfort of the victim. But the fact that the definition uses the word comfort shows that the injury we're looking for here is quite minor. So we've got to have some injury. If there's no injury at all, it's assault or battery, but we're looking for a small injury, something that interferes with your comfort. And if you think of an example I've already given you, a black eye, that's a fairly small injury, but it would interfere with the health and comfort of the victim. Let's have a look at some other cases that illustrate what has been held to be capable of being ABH. Firstly, we've got the case of Chan Fook. Be careful how you say this. It's easy to remember this case name. I remember it as, oh, Fook, he's got psychiatric injury. Okay, because in this case, the court said that if the victim is diagnosed with psychiatric injury, that can be classed as ABH. And how might this occur? Well, I've already given you an example of this. If I were to send a threatening note to someone, or say send a bullet in the post, that could cause the victim not just to be scared. If they're just scared, that's going to be an assault. But if they are diagnosed with clinical depression, with anxiety, with post-traumatic stress disorder, that could be actual bodily harm. But be careful in scenarios, because you've got to be sure that your victim has been diagnosed with a psychiatric injury. Them just feeling depressed or feeling scared is not going to be enough. That would just be assault. But if they've got a diagnosis, that can be actual bodily harm. Next case is T in the DPP. And what happened here was the defendant chased and kicked the victim, and the victim lost consciousness for a very brief period. And our defendant was found guilty of actual bodily harm. And the court said that loss of consciousness, even if it's only for a moment, can be ABH. Our next case is DPP and Smith-Michael, and in this case, the defendant cut off the victim's ponytail. And the defendant was found guilty of ABH. And the court said that cutting off a substantial amount of hair could amount to ABH. And I think that's quite an interesting case, because substantial obviously is subjective. What's substantial to me might not be to someone else. It also raises the question of hair that perhaps isn't on the head. I had a student a few years ago who came into class after having his eyebrows shaved off at a party. And I thought to myself, oh, could that be ABH? Because although eyebrows, there's not a lot of hair there compared to a ponytail, it is substantial to your face. So that's an interesting one. But cutting off a substantial amount of hair can be ABH. So we've looked at the actus reus of ABH then. Let's turn to the mens rea. And the mens rea comes from the case of Savage. And in Savage, it was made clear that for ABH, our defendant must intend or be reckless as to whether the victim fears or is subjected to the unlawful force. Now you can see here that the mens rea has got the mens rea for assault and the mens rea for battery. And that makes sense, because if you think about the actus reus, you need an assault or a battery, which has led to ABH. So for the mens rea, you must have intended or be reckless as to whether you did the assault or as to whether you applied the unlawful force. So to summarise what we've just seen on ABH then, the actus reus of section 47 ABH is that you need an assault or a battery which caused ABH. The definition of ABH comes from Miller, and it's small injuries that interfere with the health or comfort of the victim, such as the things we've looked at in the cases, being knocked unconscious, psychiatric harm, cutting off a substantial amount of hair. And the mens rea from Savage is that you've got to intend or be reckless as to whether they apprehend or are subjected to the unlawful force. Now, actual bodily harm, is the most complicated of all the non-fatal offences to apply to a scenario because you've got to do assault or battery and ABH in your answer. And so because it's a little bit tricky, I thought it'd be useful in this video if I just quickly show you how you would go about applying the law on ABH to a scenario. So I've got a situation here for you, a little mini scenario. Remember in the exam, yours would be a lot larger than this. But let's imagine I've sent Chris a threatening email saying that I'm going to petrol bomb his house, and he's so frightened that he suffers post-traumatic stress disorder. And you're being asked to advise Chris on what offence Lucy has committed. Now, I've sent him a threatening email and he's scared. And if there was no injury, you would do an assault on that. But because the scenario is telling you that he's suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, hopefully that's making you think, Chamfook, oh, it must be ABH. Okay, so we've spotted that we want to apply ABH here because that's the worst offence that this could be. So let's have a look at how you would go about applying the law. As always, we want to use IDEA, identify, define, explain, and apply. So your identification, I would say Lucy might have committed ABH under section 47 of OAPA when she sent Chris a threatening email which caused him to suffer from PTSD. So I've explained to the examiner what I'm applying to what situation. You then define the actus reus and the mens rea of section 47 ABH, because you've said it's going to be ABH, so give me the definition of ABH. Now this is where it gets a little bit harder when you go into your E, your explanation, because for the actus reus of section 47, you need an assault or a battery, which then caused ABH. So in your E, you need to start by saying the first part of the actus reus is there must have been an assault or battery. And you need to explain all of the law on assault or battery here. Now you pick whichever it was in your scenario that has led to the ABH. So in this Chris scenario, it was an assault because it was a threatening email, Constanza, which has led to post-traumatic stress disorder. So I would explain the actus reus of assault is an act which causes the victim to apprehend the infliction of immediate unlawful force. The mens rea of assault is intentional recklessness as to whether the victim apprehends the infliction of immediate unlawful force. And then I would go through all of my assault cases. If it was a battery in the scenario, let's say I punched Chris and that led to a bruise, I would say my AR and my MR of battery. So you don't have to do both here, but you just pick whichever it was in your scenario which has led to the ABH. So once you've explained the assault or the battery, then explain your ABH. So you would then say ABH was defined in Miller as any hurt or injury calculated to interfere with the health of the victim, such as, and go through your cases. And then, as always, to your application. So you need to apply the actus reus and the mens rea to your defendant's case. And remember, you must firstly decide, has there been a completed assault or battery? So I would be saying Lucy meets the actus reus of assault because she does an act, a threatening email, which can be enough, Constanza, which caused Chris to believe that he might be injured imminently, and she intended to cause him to apprehend this harm. Secondly, has the assault or battery led to ABH? Sorry, I can see an error there. Sorry. Did the assault or battery lead to ABH? And you would say here, the threatening email has led to ABH because he's got PTSD. This has been diagnosed. Chamfook says it's enough. And she had the mens rea because she intended him to be frightened. Even if she didn't intend the PTSD, that doesn't matter. She intended him to apprehend the infliction of immediate unlawful force. So that's how you go about applying the law on ABH to a scenario. So just remember that you have to do the assault or battery before you get into the ABH. Please watch the next video in which we'll be looking at GBH section 20 and 18.